Thank you for joining our Group B Strep webinar this afternoon. I'm absolutely delighted that we're doing this today. Just a reminder, if you have questions that arise during the presentation today, please add them to the Q&A session and we will pick up as many as we can after the talk. I'm delighted that Professor Philip Steer is talking to us today about Group B Strep. He's Emeritus Professor of Obstetrics and Gynecology at Imperial College London and has had a variety of roles within the British Association of Perinatal Medicine, the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, and the Royal Society of Medicine. He's Emeritus Editor of BJOG, an international journal of obstetrics and gynecology, and has a long-standing interest in Group B Strep. He's been a member of the Group B Strep Support Medical Advisory Panel since the charity started back in 1996 and chair of that panel since 2005. So I've had the joy and privilege of working with Phil for almost 25 years. And I can assure you that we couldn't be in better hands for the next half an hour as he talks to us about Group B Strep, to test or not to test. Over to you, Phil.
Thank you, Jane, for that very kind introduction. And it's a great pleasure for me. And thanks to everyone for being with us at the GBSS webinar on Group B Strep, to test or not to test. And I'm going to start by sharing my screen with you. Okay. So now you can see what we're going to be talking about. This is the Group B Streptococcus growing on an agar plate here, and it's a little row of bacteria all joined up into a line here. So Streptococcus. So as Jane very kindly said, I've been privileged to be on the medical advisory panel of GBSS for a long time and have chaired it also for quite a long time. So you must appreciate that I'm not exactly impartial, because I've always believed that women deserve to have good information and the option of being tested for Group B Strep should that be what they want. So let's start by talking about our topic. What is the Group B Streptococcus? Well, it's a bacterium, and it's commonly found in animals across the spectrum, not just humans, but fish, cattle, etc. But in cattle particularly, it causes mastitis, and then they don't produce milk properly. And that's given it the technical bacteriological name Streptococcus agalactiae. So we call it Group B Strep, the microbiologist calls it Streptococcus agalactiae. Why it's important is because between 1 in 5 and 1 in 3 and a bit more of all adults are what we call carriers. In other words, they have the Group B Streptococcus bacterium in their bowel normally. This is not a disease, it's not an illness, it's just one of the many bugs that live in the bowel. Why is it particularly important in women? Because it can track from the anus into the vagina, and a significant proportion of female carriers will therefore have Group B Strep in their vagina as well as in their bowel. And as a result of this, unfortunately, it's an important cause of perinatal sepsis. Now, this is just one paper, just to give you an idea of the prevalence. But what we can actually see is that if you look at all the serious infections, bacteremias, bacteria in the blood at 1 to 2 days of age, this is a typical study, about a third of all of these are going to be due to Group B Strep. And this can be fatal, it can cause meningitis, it can cause long-term disability. So this is a major, major issue as far as neonatal conditions are concerned. Now, it's actually a long time now, it's about 60 years coming up, that it was first suggested in the literature that GBS was such an important bacterium in terms of neonatal infection. And then in 1979, was one of the early papers which showed that if you gave the mother a broad spectrum antibiotic during labor, that this stopped the baby getting the bacteria as it passed through the birth canal, greatly reduced the carriage rate and therefore greatly reduced the infection rate. And importantly, Charles Eastman at St Mary's, and I was working with him at that time, showed that you don't have to use a broad spectrum antibiotic. In fact, penicillin is still one of the most effective antibiotics to kill Group B strep. There are 1 or 2 strains that have been found in Japan that need a little bit more penicillin than used to be the case, but all known strains of Group B strep respond to the sort of doses that we typically give to women for treatment and intrapartum prophylaxis. And I'll mention that in a minute. So how do we know when we should be offering women penicillin during labor in an attempt to prevent the baby becoming sick? Well, the first thing is that recently, following in particular in the UK, the 2017 FRCOG guidelines, we now recommend that all women in preterm labor, so all women up to 37 weeks of pregnancy who are going into labor, should be recommended to have intravenous penicillin, because the effect of GBS is particularly devastating in newborn babies. And in fact, if the baby becomes infected, the mortality rate is about 40%. So it's a really, really major problem. So this is really no longer contentious. But after 36 to 37 weeks, once you get to 37 weeks, you're now considered to be term, as we say. The overall number of infections is increased because there are so many more women delivering at that stage of pregnancy. So for every 1 preterm baby that gets a problem, 2 babies are term. But the incidence, of course, because there's so many more babies, is lower. So how do we know which women are at risk and which babies are at risk? Well, most developed countries do what we call testing. What they do is that at 36 to 37 weeks, they take a low vaginal swab, and it's low vagina, not high vaginal. This is the mistake which is sadly often made. It's a low vaginal swab, because that's where the GBS are most likely to be found, and a rectal swab. You can either do it with 2 swabs, or you can take the low vaginal first and then just pop it inside the rectum briefly, take it out, and then you can culture it. Now, you don't want to just put it on a standard agar plate, such as I showed you in my first slide. It needs to be what we call an enhanced culture medium. This has got special chemicals to help the bacterium to grow, and also antibiotics to stop other bacteria growing, so that it becomes selective and enables us to detect the GBS. The other alternative, which is what's currently in operation in the United Kingdom, is to offer to women with risk factors intrapartum antibiotics. What do we mean by risk factors? Well, obviously, if a woman's had a previous baby that's had a bad GBS infection, she clearly is a prime candidate for having antibiotics in her next labor. Another group where there's not really any controversy is that if the woman is found by chance in late pregnancy to have a carriage of Group B strep, for example, there's Group B strep in the urine in particular, so the bacteria have invaded the urine, then they should automatically be recommended to have intravenous antibiotic prophylaxis. Now, another one which is not so straightforward is the issue of fever in labor. Now, one of the main problems with fever in labor is that it's very common, particularly in women who have epidurals. And up to 1 in 4 women with epidurals will develop a fever, whether they have Group B strep or not. And therefore, what tends to happen is that they will be given intravenous penicillin when actually they may not be a carrier at all. And in fact, 3/4 of them probably won't be carriers, and they don't actually need it. And the final group is women with prolonged rupture of membranes. Now, that's not currently recommended as a risk factor in the UK, but in many countries, they do consider it a risk factor. So this is the approach. So how has this played out in real life? What I've done here is I've graphed from 1997 through to the current time, the incidence per 1,000 births of confirmed early onset GBS disease. So let's look first at the experience in the United States, which is where they first got to grips with this problem. And what we can see is that initially there was a mixture of risk factor screening and testing. By 2002, the Center for Disease Control in the US had come to the conclusion that testing was much more effective as a way of deciding which women needed the IAP, and they recommended that universally, and that's now the routine in the USA and in many, many other major countries, developed countries. And you can see that since that time, they continue to have a relatively low level of early onset GBS. So overall, about a 2 to 3-fold reduction, about an 80% drop in the incidence of early onset GBS disease. So what's happened in the UK? Well, we've since 2003, we've had routine reporting, and you can see that this is continuing, unfortunately, to increase. It's going up a lot compared with, for example, in the USA. And this is risk factor screening only. And unfortunately, in the latest for 2000 data for 2018, 2019, we've now got, you can see that it's actually jumped up quite a high. So in fact, we're now routinely running at more than double the rate in the USA. Now, that's not the whole story. The British Paediatric Surveillance Unit is a group of paediatric epidemiologists who actually, from time to time, and they've done it twice now, in the early noughties here, they did a detailed investigation looking at cases which weren't being reported. And you can see the incidence was pretty much the same as in the USA. And then in 2017, they reported on their most up-to-date data. They repeated the whole study again. And unfortunately, they found that the rate had gone up here right up to about 0.57 per thousand. So in line with the routine reporting, but at that much higher level. So this is almost certainly the true level. And then we can see now the disparity between the USA and the UK. And not only is it not going down in the UK, as you can see, both methods show that it's in fact increasing. So risk factor screening doesn't appear to have been a great success from the epidemiological point of view. As a result, the Royal College decided to reconvene the guideline group looking at prevention of early onset neonatal disease, guideline number 36. And the latest update came out just under 3 years ago, and I was a part of that team. Now, apart from recommending that, for example, all preterm labours should be given antibiotics, one of the most important outcomes of that particular review was an agreement between GBSS and the Royal College to produce a really detailed and informative leaflet explaining Group B Strep to pregnant women and giving them advice and information particularly so they could make a choice about how they wanted to deal with it. So it's a very important outcome. As you'll see later, this is now being widely disseminated. Unfortunately, not as widely disseminated as it should be. The government, the Healthcare Safety Investigation Branch, have recognized that Group B Strep is not only an important perinatal problem, but it's increasing in the United Kingdom compared with many other well-developed and well-resourced countries. So why is this? So they did this big investigation into it. Now you can look this up, it's just come out in the last few weeks, in fact, but if we look at the main conclusions, they came to a couple of important comments that they made. Firstly, the GBS information leaflets, although they are now being widely disseminated, there's still 50% of trusts that are not routinely giving out this information to pregnant women. They pointed out that this was unfortunate, and of course one of the targets that we should be aiming at is making sure that all women get this information and not just the privileged 50% who are in the right departments. The other point that they highlight very clearly is that part of the problem is that the risk factor approach is quite complicated, and it's really difficult to get people to stay on the qui-vive to look out for these risk factors and make sure that they actually pick them up when they occur, and make sure then that they get they offer the women the option of the intrapartum antibiotic prophylaxis. So they've highlighted this as a major issue, and it is one of the disadvantages of the risk factor approach, that it's much more complicated if, as a routine, you test all women 36 to 37 weeks, and then they all get offered IAP prophylaxis if they are carriers, if they're found to be carriers. That's very much simpler, and it's therefore less easy for women to get accidentally left out of the system. Now, a common question that I get asked, well, you're going to give perhaps 1 in 4 women antibiotic penicillin in labour. Is this a risky thing to do? So let's just look at the potential risks. What about antimicrobial resistance? Well, luckily, as I've already mentioned, GBS has always remained sensitive to penicillin. And penicillin is a remarkably safe antibiotic. Luckily, it has very few side effects. You can give it in very high doses without causing problems. And because it's the one that we've now been using for well over 60 years, any bugs that are liable to become resistant probably already have become resistant. So we're not going to create new problems. So I think that we're very lucky with GBS in the sense that we've got a useful antibiotic which is very effective, low side effects, and continues not to generate too much in the way of resistance. What about if you're allergic to penicillin? A lot of people, perhaps as many as 1 in 10 people, say, oh, I'm allergic to penicillin. But actually what they often mean is that they had a rash or they had a tummy upset. Now, this is not a real allergy or reaction. Anaphylaxis is when you swell up, you become edematous, you can't breathe. That can be fatal in a few cases. So obviously people were concerned about this, and there was a big follow-up in the USA. And when they first introduced and recommended screening, they followed up the first 1.8 million women, and there were no deaths from this particular cause. So from that point of view, extraordinarily safe. One UK study has reported 1 case of anaphylaxis related to GBS prophylaxis in 2.3 million women. Just the 1 case, and in that case, it was non-fatal. So although it was serious, that is an extremely low incidence, I think you'll agree. Okay, so we're not too worried about anaphylaxis. If you get a reaction, you just give adrenaline and most women will recover promptly. Now, one that's come up in the last sort of 5 years or so is growing interest in what we call the microbiome. That's the community of bacteria that live in our mouth, in our gut, and in the bowel, and in women, of course, in the vagina. And are we in danger of upsetting this by giving intravenous antibiotic prophylaxis? Well, luckily, because penicillin is narrow spectrum, there are some papers that have looked specifically at penicillin rather than the broad spectrum antibiotics, and they found a small impact in the first 2 or 3 weeks. But after the first 6 weeks, that difference appears to disappear. And importantly, if the women breastfeed, then the effects are substantially avoided. So this is another really good reason why breastfeeding should be encouraged. There's all sorts of reasons, but here's another one for you, that it helps to avoid any effect of the penicillin for IAP. Now, just recently, in fact, in May of this year, in BJOG, of which I'm the Emeritus editor, a very important paper on universal screening versus risk-based protocols came out by Hasperhoven et al. And what they did was they looked at 17 studies that had compared almost 1 million women. And they looked at women who'd been screened by testing versus those women who'd either not been screened or been screened using risk factors. And what they found was that compared with risk-based protocols, that's what we use in the UK, the screening by testing reduced the incidence by 57% compared with risk-based protocols. So adding that test for the swab at 36 to 37 weeks reduced the numbers of babies being affected by more than half. And in fact, by 70% compared with no policy. So that's why we've seen many countries reduce their incidence of early onset GBS disease by 2/3. In the US, it's actually the biggest study ever done showed it was in the US by 81%. So a very substantial reduction in early onset GBS by testing as opposed to the risk factor screening. And in fact, they found that the risk-based protocols were not effective at all compared with doing nothing. And I think that's in part because it's so complicated, it very often doesn't get done properly anyway. Then the other thing that is being raised as an issue is, well, if you're doing all this testing and 1 in 4 women turn out to be carriers, you're going to give those 1 in 4 women antibiotics. Isn't that a bad thing? Well, it turns out that if you use the risk-based protocols, given things like fever and so on and so forth, you end up with almost the same proportion of women getting the antibiotic, except that they're not necessarily the right women, because a lot of these women being given antibiotics anyway will actually be GBS negative. They won't be carriers, so they didn't actually need it in the first place. So the advantage of testing is that at least if you're giving antibiotics, you're giving it to the right women. Now, moving on, one of the criticisms that's always been made about the policy of testing is that despite there's nearly 1 million women that there have been epidemiological studies, it's never actually been shown in a scientific randomized controlled trial, the gold standard, to be of benefit compared with the risk factor approach. And for that reason, the National Institute for Health Research in the UK have funded to the tune of £2.8 million a large-scale cluster randomized trial in 18 hospitals. £2.8 million, so it's a considerable amount of money, but it's a really important question to finally sort this out once and for all. So what they will do is compare the current risk factor in 40 units, and in the other 40 units, they'll be offered, half of them will have one sort of testing and the other half the other. So half of them will get the standard culture-based testing with the swabs at 36, 37 weeks that is so widespread around the world. And then the other 20 units will try testing women at the beginning of labor by polymerase chain reaction. Now, this is extremely sensitive and it picks up the DNA in the bacteria. And so it tells you whether those bacteria are there or not very, very accurately. The snag is, firstly, you've got to get the women in early enough in labor to do the test. Secondly, it takes an hour or so to do it. Thirdly, it's quite an expensive test compared with the culture, probably 2 or 3 times as expensive. And then, of course, you may have run out of time to get the antibiotics in to be effective. The advantage, one of the big advantages of doing the culturing at 36, 37 weeks, you can tell the women they're carriers, they know to come in early in labor, or if their waters break, they know about that. They can discuss with their family and their partner whether they want to have the antibiotics and so on. So they come in well informed, knowing what to ask for. Whereas if you're suddenly in strong labor and somebody suddenly pops up and says, we've just done your test and you're Group B Strep positive, it's not necessarily the best time to be thinking about what you want to do. Now, another option that's become very important in recent years is the question of a vaccine. Why a vaccine? Well, as early as preventing early onset disease, it can prevent disease in the mother. Now, this is rare. It's a rare cause of maternal mortality or disease, but it does occur that mothers get sick from Group B Strep infection. So that could be prevented in a large number of cases. About 1 in 100 stillbirths are actually caused by GBS getting into the amniotic fluid and into the baby, even though the mother's not in labor. So although it's a small proportion, again, a vaccine could potentially prevent that, because otherwise we don't know when it's going to happen. A bigger issue is the issue of late onset disease. Now, for every 2 babies that get early onset disease, there will be another baby that will get this weeks or months later, not later than 3 months, but usually around sort of 6, 7, 8 weeks later. Now, at the moment, we know that intrapartum antibiotic prophylaxis does not prevent late onset disease, has no effect on it. But it's possible that if we raise lots of antibodies to GBS in the mother and she passes those to the baby, which is why it would be effective, that they would persist long enough to have a good effect on reducing late onset disease. And that would be a really big advantage of the vaccine. And of course, the other thing is we wouldn't have to give antibiotics. So there would be no question of producing antibiotic resistance. And equally, it's very unlikely that the antibodies would have an effect on the microbiome to any significant degree, certainly be more specific than even penicillin. So that would be an advantage. Another big advantage is that once you start producing large amounts of vaccine, it's inexpensive. Now, penicillin is very cheap anyway, but you still got the expense of the testing. So a vaccine could well be cost effective, and it would reduce antibiotic use. There are some disadvantages, however. The most important one is that GBS is not just a single bacterium. Lots and lots of strains of them. At the moment, sort of 20, 30 strains have been recognized. And we need to get vaccine and antibodies to work against at least 5 of these different major strains. They don't all cause the same amount of disease. So the 5 top of the pops, the most popular bacteria, or unpopular, depending on your point of view, you need to produce antibodies against all of them to get 85% prevention. Another issue, of course, is that we've got to persuade mothers to have the vaccine. Now, our experience with pertussis and flu vaccines suggests that at least 85% of women would be happy to have a vaccine if they were reassured that it was effective and safe. So that's not too much of a worry. We do, however, need to overcome the anti-vaxxers, but I don't want to get stuck in that. Now, the other thing, of course, is that it's very complex and costly to develop a vaccine, especially against a bacterium. Viruses are relatively simple organisms, and so actually, surprisingly, it's not that difficult to get vaccines to be active against a particular bit of the virus. And if you get the right bit, then it can be very effective. With bacteria, it needs to be a more complex vaccine, and that's been an issue. So if, for example, we look at the GSK trivalent GBS vaccine, trivalent means it was active against the 3 most prevalent strains, and they piloted this in South Africa, which has a high incidence of GBS invasive disease. They not only got their medical research council and Baragwanath Hospital, which was a huge academic hospital in Johannesburg, but also the London School of Hygiene. So this all looked very, very promising, and they were getting some good initial results. But because it was only trivalent, they eventually decided it wasn't going to be cost effective, and so they stopped the development. So this is unfortunate, and this is what's tended to happen with vaccine development. Now, there are a couple of others. At the moment, we think there are as many as perhaps 5 companies that are actively working on this. 2 big ones, Pfizer in New York, they've already produced some evidence relating to a hexavalent vaccine. And then there's another group, the BioVac, which is a national vaccine research institute in Cape Town in South Africa. They've been funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to work on their vaccine. So there is some potential, but we find that at GBSS over the years, we've been constantly told, oh, you'll have a vaccine in 10 years. And that was 20 years ago, and it still looks like it's going to be 10 years. So in the meantime, we can't afford to ignore the potential for testing and IAP. Now, if you want a nice, convenient summary of what I've been talking about this afternoon, if you go on to Google and you just type in European Journal of Obs and Gynae and Reproductive Biology, or indeed our names, you will get this full-length article. It's not actually in a print version yet, but it's available free online, and it covers all these issues that I've been talking about today in much more detail. Gives you the incidence, maternal neonatal infection, epidemiology, prevention and screening that we've been talking about, including testing, the microbiome, breastfeeding, neonatal management, a section about what women think about GBS and vaccines and all that sort of thing. So I commend it to you as an informative paper. I would say that because I was one of the authors, so was Jane. So we do think we know a little bit about this topic. So I can recommend that to you wholeheartedly. So we've come to the 30 minutes of the time that I've set myself to give us time for questions and discussion, just to end up with some conclusions. I think we must all agree that early onset GBS disease is an important and importantly preventable cause of perinatal mortality and morbidity. And up to 80% of these cases can be prevented by a very simple approach, testing 36 to 37 weeks coupled with intrapartum antibiotic prophylaxis. A risk factor approach, we think, has not worked. It's not working and should not be considered a reasonable response to this problem. We do, however, very strongly support the planned randomized controlled trial, and indeed Jane was one of the applicants on the grant application. So we are giving that as much support as we can, because an RCT is always a good thing to convince any doubters or skeptics about the appropriate approach. And finally, we do also support the importance of trying to encourage the development of a vaccine, because this would have significant advantages. But in the meantime, let's not forget that we do have still a very effective way of reducing the scourge that causes so much damage to newborn babies. Okay, so that's my presentation, and I'll stop sharing my screen, and we'll see if there are any questions that people wish to ask us.
Fabulous. Well, as always, Phil, I think that was a hugely interesting and whistle-stop tour around the issues around Group B Strep, and you packed in a huge amount into half an hour. So we do have a number of questions. We've also had some questions that have been that arose before the webinar, but let's go to the questions that have been asked. So one of the questions is, oh gosh, they're coming in thick and fast. So one of the questions is there anything that can be given to women wanting a home birth?
Okay, well, the issue there is whether or not they can have intravenous penicillin safely during labor. Unfortunately, oral antibiotics are not very effective. They don't get absorbed to the same degree quickly enough. And in labor, the stomach doesn't absorb nutrients very well at all. And therefore, giving oral antibiotics is not really possible. So it has to be intravenous. Even intramuscular is not good enough. So the question there is whether you have a midwife who feels confident about giving you intravenous penicillin. They would have to have some adrenaline on hand just in case you're the 1 in 10,000 who gets the anaphylactic reaction. But the majority of people feel that it's a safe approach. And having Group B strep, therefore, is not an automatic reason why you can't have a home birth. And it's certainly not a reason why you can't have one in a midwifery unit. Lots of midwifery units do offer IAP to women, even though they're not on the same site as the obstetric unit. So that's possible.
That's very helpful. I confess I've never understood really why we can't give IV antibiotics at home in labour. We give IV antibiotics at home in so many situations outside of maternity care. But I think that's probably a different question. There's also a question that's been asked, are there any figures with regard to water birth and reduction or increase in transmission rates? And I know water birth was one of the issues that the FRCOG's guideline development group that you were on looked at.
Yes, I'm not aware of any good evidence that suggests it increases or decreases the risk. I think that basically appropriate hygiene should do the job, irrespective of whether you have a water birth or not. And equally, if you're known to be a carrier, then the intravenous antibiotic prophylaxis we think is just as effective if you have a water birth as if you don't. So it shouldn't be a problem.
Excellent. There's another question which is asking whether there's a reason why the guideline on Group B strep is steered by the FRCOG alone, and asking about input from the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health, the Royal College of Midwives, Royal College of GPs, etc., on the basis that clearly we need an all hands on deck approach to prevention.
Yeah, the guideline is printed and produced and disseminated by the FRCOG, but it does include a very expert neonatologist with representation from BAPM. It also includes Paul Heath, who is an extremely knowledgeable person about the microbiology of Group B strep. So it is multidisciplinary in that regard.
Excellent. Thank you. Another question is how reliable is the home test? And is it easy to do yourself or better to do in hospital?
Right. There are studies which have looked at the efficiency of women taking the swabs themselves, and they've shown that provided they're given appropriate instructions, it appears to be no less effective and efficient than it being done by a professional. So as long as you read the instructions and do them, carry them out, we think that the effectiveness at screening and testing that way is just as good with the home testing kits as it would be. And as long as you return the swabs immediately, they need to get back in the appropriate transport medium within 48 hours. But as long as you get them back to the lab promptly, there should be no loss of sensitivity. So this is a perfectly reasonable and effective way of doing it. And of course, that could be extremely useful during the pandemic. You don't even need to go near the hospital to get a test.
Excellent. So so there are some questions coming in on chat and some questions coming in Q&A. So I'm getting confused between the two. So please only ask the question once, and we'll try and pick it up. So we've had a question. I had a woman in labour who tested negative for Group B Strep, but developed a temperature in labour. And then the placenta was sent for histopathology and came back positive for Group B Strep. Can you comment on this, please? Or have you experienced this before?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things is that the closer the test that you do antenatally is to when you go into labour, the more accurate it's going to be, because some women do stop being carriers, a few, perhaps 10%, something like this, by the time they go into labour. So the longer the gap, the more likely the woman may have become negative. If the test is negative, the number of women who then become positive is pretty small. We think it's around about 3 to 4% only. And that's because most women actually test negative. So presumably this woman was one of the women who had acquired Group B Strep in some way or another in between having the test. There is also, of course, the possibility that the culture is not 100% sensitive. It's interesting, for example, when people look now about the incidence of early onset Group B Strep, they find that many of the cases are on women who actually tested negative, but it's nearly always that's because all the women who tested positive have had the antibiotics and therefore the babies don't get affected. So that you've got to be careful to balance those two factors out. It's not 100% reliable. So that's true of most things in life.
Absolutely. A question that came up before the webinar was whether there's any difference in carriage rates or infection rates in BAME women and their babies. Are you able to comment on that at all?
Yep, I'll just share my screen with you again. So we go back to the slide. And hopefully, yes, you should be seeing that now. Early onset disease rates in the USA in 2015 were reported in JAMA. And as you'll see, the incidence in the USA, as you'd expect, is quite low in the majority population of white European. But worryingly, in the African Americans, it was 2.5 times as high. That's a really high rate. And there have been suggestions that this was the case from studies in Africa as well. We know, for example, that Black African people in South Africa have high rates, and I've already referred to that. And it may be partly due to differences in the vaginal microbiome. And this was another study that showed, for example, that if you look at the distribution of different bacterial communities, this, for example, is lactobacilli, you'll see that the incidence is much lower of these protective bacteria in women of Black African origin. There are various complicated theories as to why this is, but it does seem to explain, for example, why Black African women are about twice as likely to suffer from bacterial vaginosis as white women. And also you'll see that there's a big increase here in relatively protective bacteria in Asians, South Asians, and they actually have a relatively somewhat lower incidence of problem than either white Europeans, and certainly much lower than the Black community. Now, there's just been one study in the UK, but this has been looking at colonization rates, so not actually neonatal infection, but obviously they tend to go hand in hand. So the lowest rate was actually in South Asians, 23%, somewhat higher in the white British, but again, people of Black African origin, a substantially higher rate of colonization. So we think that there is a real difference here, and whether it's entirely cultural, there's a strong suggestion from various studies of the microbiome and so on that there are genetic elements here. But it means that we've got to be particularly assiduous. If you have a high rate of people of Black African origin in your community, then you're going to be particularly benefited by having a testing an IAP regime in your maternity services.
That's really helpful, and just as background information, this question is something that the charity is raising with the government and the Department of Health, because it would be really helpful to have better information about that. We've several more questions. So do we know how many maternity units are using ECM testing in pregnancy?
You're probably a better place to answer that than I am, actually.
Yeah, yes, I thought I was, and I checked with Oliver because he is the keeper of that data. And we estimate that we did an exercise the second half of last year to ask maternity units around the UK what they were doing. And the response at that point was that around 10% of units were using ECM testing. Hopefully that may have increased in the interim, and maybe on the back of the HSIB report as well, that will have increased.
A quick comment, we have discussed this, as you know, with Paul Cosford of PHE, Public Health England, and he has repeatedly assured us that if women specifically ask for a Group B Strep test, they must tell the obstetrician or the midwife, I would like a test, but I want it for Group B Strep, not the standard vaginal culture for things like thrush and trichomonas. And he has assured us that if that request is passed on, then the trust should be making sure that they get the proper ECM test done. Now, that is something that remains a bit of a contentious issue, but that's the official line, is that it should be available.
And I think that leads very nicely into another question that we've been asked with, is why has routine testing at 35 to somewhere between 35 and 37 weeks not become routine practice?
This is always a $64,000 question, and one which, if we had another hour, we might be able to begin to answer it. There has been an understandable concern from the National Screening Committee, who've always set their face against testing, about giving large numbers of women antibiotics when only, well, we say only, if you're a carrier, your baby has about a 1 in 4 chance of ending up in special care being sick. Now, to a lot of people, that's high enough risk. And when we can prevent 80% of that, why not for something as simple as penicillin? But they've nonetheless taken a rather hardline view about the use of antibiotics in such large numbers. But our answer, of course, has always been, as found in the meta-analysis, that actually women get antibiotics for all sorts of reasons. And actually, it's better to target it at the women who are genuinely, and the babies that are genuinely at risk, rather than just spray it across women because they've got a temperature or some other not very predictive risk factor. None of the risk factors, apart from having had a previous baby with GBS, are particularly sensitive in terms of or predictive compared with actually having a test. So I can, you can understand what's behind their reluctance, but we just take the view that since we're recommending penicillin, since it's such a safe antibiotic, since it's so effective against Group B Strep, as it seems to have so few side effects, that women should be given the information and allowed to choose for themselves. The test is not particularly expensive. I mean, on the NHS, it could be £15 or thereabouts. Even privately, it's only about, what, 35 to 45 pounds. So it's not a very expensive test. And the antibiotics, penicillin is remarkably cheap. It's certainly an awful lot cheaper than having your baby in neonatal intensive care for 10 days. So we've always taken the view that this should be something that the women should be entrusted to make up their own mind and decide for themselves. Some politicians that we've spoken to and the National Screening Committee feel that women shouldn't be given that option, and we disagree with them. So that's always been the standoff over the last 20 years.
Yeah, and in addition, an awful lot of other developed countries also believe that women should be offered the choice, and the impact on their babies has been significant.
Yeah. I mean, it's somewhat ironic, of course, that we're sitting here being told that our view is unconventional, as it were, by the National Screening Committee. And yet, if we were in the USA or France or Germany or Spain or Italy or just about any other developed country, we would be the norm. We would be the standard practice, and it would be the NSC that would be considered eccentric. But you know, that's life.
Yeah, I remember being at a conference where the question was raised. Really, that's what the UK is doing? with that degree of surprise and consternation. Another question that a couple of people have asked, although slightly different ways, is whether there are any data on how the offer of intrapartum antimicrobial prophylaxis impacts choices for women in terms of labour.
Right. Well, as I've already said, it shouldn't impact significantly. We know of many units, midwifery units, standalone units, where they give IAP. There is no fundamental reason why it couldn't be given in a home birth. So that's really a question of people's confidence. I can see that the anxiety amongst midwives will be, well, what if the woman has an anaphylactic reaction? Well, if she's got adrenaline handy, it shouldn't really be a major issue. It's extremely rare. And there are many other things that can cause reactions that you do to people in labour. So it all comes down to a matter of choice. That's something that, again, that each individual pregnant woman needs to discuss with her caregivers, where they put that balance of risk. Are they more interested in a 1 in 10,000 risk of having a reaction, and perhaps a 1 in 2 to 3 million of dying of themselves, compared with a 1 in 400 chance the baby will end up in neonatal intensive care? So that's the choice, really, that only the woman herself can make for her child.
Fabulous, thank you. The questions keep coming. In terms of late onset Group B strep disease, we've been asked, and I recognise that you're an obstetrician rather than a paediatrician or a neonatologist, but I'll ask it anyway. We've been asked where the source of late onset Group B strep infection is likely to be, and also the timing of late onset GBS infections.
Yeah, if you look at the graphs of the onset, the great majority of GBS disease occurs in the first 12 hours of life, and then much of the remainder in the next 24 hours, and then a bit more in the first week. But then it stays at a relatively low level, quite a low level, but because each day is a potential risk, it adds up eventually to about a third of the total cases, up to about 3 months, and then after that it becomes exceedingly rare. So that's the incidence. Now, in terms of studies, I am aware of studies that have been done looking at the source of the GBS. And it turns out that about half can be traced back to the mother or the father or within the family. And another half are what we call nosocomial. In other words, they come from somebody else. And it might be somebody, a staff member, it could be all sorts of people. So it isn't necessarily the parents who give the baby the GBS in late onset. It's about sort of 50-50 is my understanding of the situation.
Another question is around, are there alternatives to antibiotics, and would, for example, something like probiotics reduce vaginal colonization and impact?
Well, there's some interesting work that's being done on that. For example, it's been shown that certain polysaccharides in breast milk seem to be effective, and there have been thoughts and potential trials being looked at with producing these sorts of specialized sugars and feeding them to mothers during pregnancy to convey some degree of improved resistance as far as the baby's concerned. There have been some probiotics that have been looked at to try and improve the protective bacteria in the vagina and thereby reduce GBS. The problem is that there's not just one microbiome. We know at least 6 different major groups of microbiomes, different community types they're called, between different women. And it seems that if we are to do something useful with probiotics in future, what we're going to have to do is actually identify the particular set of bacteria, and there could be 20, 30 of them in the vagina of each individual woman, and then work out which particular probiotic to give her. It won't be, it's very unlikely to be one size fits all. So you'd have to go and say, well, this is my setup. Can you produce a bit of this and a bit of that, and that'll balance it up more. So it certainly isn't going to be a straightforward, simple thing that you can go and buy in a chemist. It would probably be a procedure which you'd have to go through to identify your microbiome, and then for the specialist to generate an appropriate probiotic. Equally, this is likely just to simply reduce the risk. It's not likely to reduce it by, I would suggest, not more than 30, 40%, something like that. It's not going to be as effective as a vaccine, for example.
Interesting, and an area where I think, as we've discussed more than once over the years, that more research is sorely needed before any real recommendations can be made.
Just to emphasize that point about the breastfeeding, sometimes you get concern from women who are known to be carriers. Should I be breastfeeding? Might I give it to my baby that way? The first thing is that oral ingestion of bacteria, they're usually killed off in the stomach. So that is unlikely to be a route of infection. Secondly, the antibodies in the mother's breast milk more than compensate for any Group B strep that there might be lurking around in her breast milk. So we're absolutely clear that being a carrier of GBS is not a reason not to breastfeed.
Excellent, good point, thank you. We've had an inquiry from a question from a student midwife who says that it seems, I'm going to read it, it seems near on impossible as a student midwife to implement changes into practice. Any suggestions will be welcomed. Rather broader than Group B strep, but an interesting question.
Yeah, there was an interesting study published in the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine about 20 years ago, which actually looked at the time interval between a new procedure or a new piece of evidence being discovered and then actually being implemented in routine practice. And they came up with an average of 17 years.
17?
17.
Holy cow. Sorry.
So there are many things that I've known for 30 years that I still talk to my colleagues about, and they say, really? I didn't know that. Part of it is the fact that when people are qualified, the current situation is that for many people, there aren't comprehensive mandatory updating or retraining sessions throughout their career. By and large, once you're a consultant or a midwife, that's it. Now, people go to refreshers, but often they're very limited and very superficial. And until we develop a culture whereby it's routine for everybody to spend a lot more time updating themselves about the latest guidelines, then we're going to have a problem. In fact, one of the articles that I wrote appeared just 2 months ago in the British Journal, BJOG. I actually said, we've spent the last 25 years developing lots of excellent guidelines. Now we need to spend at least the next 25 years trying to work out how to get people to follow them.
Yeah,
it's not a simple issue.
Yes, and you know, I would say this, you know, in terms of, you know, get in touch with the charity as well for download the guidelines. Make sure that the guideline update committee within your trust has updated your local guidelines in line with the latest FRCOG guidelines. The charity can provide summaries of those guidelines, because whilst I'm sure everybody on this webinar read every word of the FRCOG's 26 pages of the green top on Group B strep, not everybody will. So we have a 7-page summary, and as Phil mentioned earlier, we're providing leaflets, the information leaflets that we co-wrote with the FRCOG free of charge to the NHS. On top of that, just earlier this month, we worked with the Royal College of Midwives to develop an online learning course. It's about 45 minutes long, and it's available free of charge to all Royal College of Midwives members on their iLearn platform. So I think knowledge and awareness and improved education around Group B strep will help as well. We are faster.
I think what we should do is echo what the WHO have said about coronavirus, COVID-19. Testing, testing, testing are the priority. And perhaps we can add to that training, training, and training.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we've, let's see if we can squeeze in a couple before our hour is up. Is there anything more that can be done to make women more aware of their ability to ask for ECM testing if not all authorities are giving women the leaflet? Yeah, and a comment that it seems wrong that the onus is on the women to know to ask rather than being provided with the information to do that.
Well, I'm currently in the process of helping colleagues develop an app for pregnant women to give them information which will enable them to request appropriate care from their caregivers. Part of the problem is that there's so much knowledge and information, it really is difficult for professionals to know it all and to implement it all. So a different and radical approach is to use artificial intelligence so that women themselves can find out what their specific risks and issues are, and then give them the questions to go to the professionals to ask about. This will empower the women to go to the professionals and say, I need answers to X, Y, and Z, and can I have X, Y, and Z? We need to empower people to know that that should be the way of the future. So you're not just being told what to do by midwives and obstetricians, you're actually a true partner in your care. And it's just as important that you understand what's going on as the fact that they understand it. You understand it, you can make sure they understand it.
Excellent. We've had another question about what should we do for women who don't speak or read English?
I think, again, you're best to answer that. There have been translations, I think, into other languages.
Yeah, there have been, but unfortunately at the moment, not of the current leaflets. It's something that we've tried to get funding for. And unfortunately, we have not as yet been successful. So if anyone happens to know where funders exist to translate important information materials into other language, we would love to hear about that. You know,
we'd love to do it. We haven't had the funds so far.
Yeah, I wish. I mean, the best poor option that there is, or the best option that there is, which is still pretty poor, is to stick it into Google Translate, but that's not exactly ideal. We have oh, there's an interesting question about, is it not perhaps the confidence of midwives so much as the guidelines of the trusts involved? Could you supply the evidence for using antibiotics in a home birth or a midwife-led environment?
You can try.
Yeah, we can try. I mean, the evidence is out there in terms of anaphylaxis and resistance. So maybe that's our next article, Phil, that we should be writing. So one last question, and please, we will try and follow up with these questions after the webinar. If you've asked the question anonymously, we won't be able to do that. So do email us at info@gbss.org.uk, and we will try and come back to you with a response. But the final question is, how can we get NHS trusts to inform mothers about Group B Strep support, because this doesn't happen universally?
Yeah, I think what you can do is take the RCOG guidelines. If you want to download those from the website, they're free. They're on the RCOG website, and you can get a free copy, download it, of the information leaflet, and then take it to your trust managers or your senior clinical managers and say, this is the national recommendation that women should be given this information. Here it is. How are you going to make sure it happens? Because actually you're pursuing the official recommended line. So you're not being disruptive or unconventional by asking for women to be given information. You should actually be the norm.
Absolutely. And in that leaflet are the charity's contact details. So, yeah, fantastic. So I think, thank you very much. We've taken just over an hour of your time, and thank you to everybody for joining. Do go to our website and download the information materials. There's a particular area for health professionals on our website, which should make it easy to access both the information materials that we provide, but also the latest guidelines from the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, from NICE, from Public Health England, etc. And the link is in the chat. The article that Phil mentioned that was published earlier this month, published online earlier this month, the link to that is also in the chat, but we will be back in touch with everybody who's given us their email address for this webinar. It's been a joy and a privilege. It's the first webinar that we've hosted from Group B Strep Support. So, you know, it's been fantastic. Thank you for all the interest. Thank you for the fabulous questions, and particularly a huge thank you to Phil for all of his amazing expertise and knowledge that he's shared today. So thank you very much, and do stay in touch, and hopefully we will do more of these in future.